chat room, which is now open, by going to ancientfaith.com/live. Another way to connect with us is to go to facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday and place your question in the thread for tonight's show. You can also send us an email at aft@ancientfaith.com. And remember that our show is now being live simulcast on the AFR Facebook and YouTube pages. So let's get started. A recent poll conducted by Gallup and Knight Foundation found a, quote, widening gap between what Americans expect from the news media and what they think they are getting. While Americans increasingly value the media's role in our democracy, they are losing confidence in the idea of an objective media as perceptions of bias grow. For instance, while 84% of Americans confirm that media is vital for democracy, nearly half, 49%, think that the media is very biased. 56% admit that their own news sources are biased, and 7 in 10 are concerned about the biased news that others are getting. And that one made me chuckle. Nearly 3 in 4 people worry that owners of media companies are pushing an agenda by influencing news coverage. 54% of people believe that reporters intentionally misrepresent facts. All of these numbers are way up, even from the 1980s, when most Americans trusted the media to report factually instead of with a slant. Not surprisingly, in the age of social media, even Orthodox Christians are not immune from this type of reporting. Take, for instance, the row between Constantinople and Moscow. One can easily find religious-based news sources that clearly slant the news in favor of their respected churches in one direction or the other. Sadly, we've become so accustomed to the bias, whether secular or otherwise, that we have difficulty separating fact from opinion. Here to help us separate that fact from fiction, truth from fake news, is veteran journalist Terry Mattingly. Terry Mattingly writes the nationally syndicated On Religion column for the Universal UClick Syndicate and is senior fellow for media and religion at the King's College in New York City. He's the founder of the Washington Journalism Center there. He double majored in journalism and history at Baylor University and then earned an MA at Baylor in Church-State Studies and an MS in Communications at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. Terry has lectured at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, the Torrey's Honor Program at Biola University, the School of Journalism at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, Baylor University, the University of Mississippi, and in other settings across the nation. He's the editor of the excellent and informative site getreligion.org, and you can find all things Terry Mattingly at tmat.net. And with that, Terry, welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Glad to be here. I think the only thing I would change in that is I'm not connected to the King's College anymore.
Okay.
I'm now a senior fellow at the Overby Center at the University of Mississippi.
Very good. Well, that's just like you, telling the truth and separating the inaccuracies. So.
One fact to pick out.
I appreciate that very much. So we'll have to get Religion to update your bio on there. So we're so happy.
I'm very sorry for that.
That's okay.
I sure wish. We're in the world of software. We're kind of at the Tower of Babel stage, where the gods don't want to talk to each other. All those tech guys think they're God, and they don't talk to each other. And I have to get that updated with the help of somebody else. But I will do that shortly, because now you've stung me on that, so that's fine.
That is okay, and I'm happy you're here, and I'm happy that you are working somewhere, because we need your influence. So Terry, tell us a little bit about yourself before we get into the topic at hand. Tell us how you became interested in journalism, and I know that you're a member of St. Anne's in Tennessee. Tell us about your spiritual journey too.
Well, those are connected in the sense that I tell people my mother was a language arts teacher and my father was a Southern Baptist pastor in Texas, which is kind of the wallet that the Southern Baptist Convention sits on. You don't get much more Baptist than Texas. And I grew up, I'm very proud of my Baptist heritage, very much like my spiritual father, the late Father Gordon Walker, who I never heard say a negative word about his Baptist heritage. And was thankful for all that Him gave him. For those who know Father Gordon, they will know that's true. So I grew up Southern Baptist. I went to Baylor University, and it was at Baylor that I suddenly realized it's very hard to major in music if you can't play the piano. And so I decided I better learn to do something else with my hands related to music, and I thought I was going to be a music writer. But right in the middle of my experience and work at Baylor, I became, with the help of a famous journalism professor named David McCam, I became convinced that religion had to be one of the worst covered subjects in all of American journalism, especially when you consider how important it is to how this nation functions and debates important subjects, et cetera, et cetera. So I decided to go into the field of religion writing. About that same time, in the mid to late 70s, the Southern Baptist Convention broke out into a civil war, and I began looking hard at myself and realized that I simply stated was not a free church Protestant. And like many people, that meant I spent some time in Anglicanism, but eventually found my way into Orthodoxy with the help of Father Gordon Walker, but also Father J. Stephen Freeman, another well-known personality online, and the founding priest of our church here in Oak Ridge. And I got to know him when he was an Episcopal pastor and was on his way out of a major church. He was almost elected a bishop at one stage, and realized he was going to have to go to Orthodoxy if he was going to live with himself. And with the help of a small band of interesting people in the state of Tennessee, which is a very interesting place in Orthodoxy, when you throw in St. Ignatius Parish, Father Gordon's old parish right there in the Nashville area.
Right.
It's an interesting state. And so in the late 1990s, 1998 to be precise, my wife and I and our children and about 15 or 16 other people, it was one of those things that we had to start a mission in order to join it. And it's not easy to come to Orthodoxy in Johnson City, Tennessee, but we managed to do so. Also, to drop another name there, about that time in the 90s, early in the 90s, I became close friends with two other Anglicans by the name of Father Gary Matthews Green and his wife Frederica. And so as the internet arrived, I began following their journey, and they became very important people. And Father Gregory Matthews Green was my family's priest for 12 or 13 years in Maryland. So that's another key figure. And folks, life doesn't get much better than having people like Gordon Walker, Stephen Freeman, and Father Gregory Matthews Green as your spiritual fathers.
You were well shepherded.
That's some heavy hitters right there.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So, obviously, the topic at hand is journalism, and because we are all affected by it, I know that some people might wonder, well, why are we talking about this? You know, this is an Orthodox program, but the reality is we are all affected by news coverage, and we are going to talk about religious coverage in the secular media, and why is that almost invisible these days? But we'll get to that in a second. I want to get to the sort of the definition of what we're talking about tonight, and that is media bias. So if you had to define it, obviously you're a professor at the university, and you specialize in kind of making sure that this doesn't happen. Is it possible, first of all, for journalism, for a journalist to be without bias? Because I think about when you undertake the writing process, there's always going to be some perception, inner perception. So I guess maybe the background question is, how does a journalist avoid media bias? How would you define media bias? And, let's talk about the listeners in a second. So let's start there. What's media bias? How can a journalist be aware of their own bias?
Well, first of all, I want to start off in a strange way with that. I'm going to explain it the way I would explain it to my students. Stop and think about it this way. If you were asked if the American court system is perfect, would you say yes or no?
Me personally, I would say no.
You
of course,
personally.
It's not perfect. I mean, there are, we know that there have been decisions that have been overturned later. There has been evidence that has come out.
Yeah.
I think they try their best, but, at the end, you have to make a decision.
So the next question is, if something of a legal, if you were accused of something and you found yourself on trial, is there a court system elsewhere in the world that you would rather be tried under?
Probably not.
Exactly, and that's my point. In other words, I would say that what we used to call the American model of the press, which is where reporters were committed to a set of professional standards. Now, notice I said standards. This is what you're striving for. You had standards of accuracy, fairness, balance, and the word objectivity was not used in the philosophical sense of having a blank slate inside your head where you didn't believe anything. Objectivity was defined as striving to meet these standards. It was a kind of professional objectivity of professional standards. So that's the first thing I would say. The public should never expect journalists to be immune from the fall of humanity. I mean, if all of God's creation
Right.
is both glorious and fallen, journalism is going to have its glorious moments and it's going to have lots of fallen moments. So what we need to say is that the press used to have certain professional goals. And what we're wondering is if something terrible has happened that has made them stop seeking those goals. And as they have stopped seeking it, they have turned into one of the engines driving division in our culture.
Right.
Now, the second half of my answer is, you asked me to define media bias. Well, let's deal with the hot term right now, which is fake news. Now, one of the problems with the term fake news is that nobody agrees on what it means. So let me walk you through, let me get academic here for a second.
Sure.
And walk
yeah,
you
absolutely.
through
Please.
I'm going to walk you through a typology of different ways that people use fake news as a term. And of course, how they use it tells you a lot about where they are in our culture, where they are politically, and whatever else. Okay, first of all, some people use the term fake news to refer to rumors and outright hoaxes. I think everybody can agree that there's a lot of that, especially on the internet, and that we can agree and throw conspiracy theories into there as well. So that's number one. But some people use fake news when what they actually mean is flawed, messed up reports that are full of mistakes and factual errors. That's you could call that badly reported news.
Right.
Okay, then the third thing you've got is if you have American journalism is that old set of standards of what you're going to try to do. European journalism, which is even older, it's what came to America in the colonies, was openly advocacy-based journalism, where newspapers were very open about what they believed was true, what they believed was false, who they believed was right, who they believed was wrong. And this advocacy was sometimes stated right in the masthead. You knew you were dealing with a labor paper or a conservative paper or a Catholic paper or whatever. And this advocacy journalism that's clearly biased is sometimes referred to as fake news. You would not believe the amount of emails I get from people who say, "Can you believe how biased this story is?" And they send me the URL, and it isn't a story, it's an editorial column.
Yeah, I guess that's... Yeah, I was just going to say that is the question there, because when you were speaking about sort of an advocacy that, you know, historically predates this era of accusing people of fake news, does that mean that the newspaper is driven by the editorial board? Obviously, there are newspapers that have a particular advocacy. For instance, if you have, let's say, I don't know, a local Jewish newspaper, you know, in the United States that's pro-Israel, right, pro-Zionist. I mean, that's very clear. Everybody knows that, and so forth. But if you take something like CNN or the New York Times, I think it's a little bit harder for lay people to be able to navigate that, because they don't expect them to be advocacy based.
Or almost as bad, they've given up expecting any standards at those publications and newsrooms at all. So let me finish my typology real quick. So number 3 was that advocacy journalism that ends up in the news pages. Number 4 is outright opinion features, things that are supposed to be biased. They're supposed to be expressing opinion. And here's a subtle one, but it's one that we're having a lot of trouble with today. I would also, in this typology, put the stories that you read them and you suddenly realize that the entire story is based on anonymous sources. And you have absolutely no idea where this information is coming from, what the biases are of the people that are giving this information to the journalists, and you end up reading stories that violate some of the standards of this old journalism, where you were supposed to at least have some idea of how to evaluate the quality of the information based on who the information is being attributed to. So that's a 5. And then number 6, and this is, you're going to be glad to know this is the end. Number 6 is, some people use the term fake news when it's basically news that their favorite politicians, notice I said plural, not singular, their favorite politicians want them to think is fake. Or it's news that makes those politicians mad, so they call it fake. And this happens on the left, but it most famously happens on the political right, if you're willing to consider that Donald Trump is sincerely some kind of conservative, which I'm still not totally convinced of, but we won't get into arguing about the Trump era. But do you see how complex that is? Yet how many times have you had people in your parish or in other situations walk up to you and say, "Can you believe all this fake news we're dealing with? You know, I don't know what to believe anymore because I don't know where to get news that isn't fake." And it takes 30 to 40 minutes sometimes to figure out what they're actually telling you, what they're actually saying. And a lot of this is rooted in the internet age, which has splintered our information sources into, 666 million options, out there. And nobody knows how to evaluate the sources that they're reading. And there's good reason for that, because the sources themselves are often complex and somewhat confused. And we'll come back to that later. But was that a long answer to your question that helped?
No, it's very helpful. In other words, the idea is that media bias is not just one category. There are grades of ways of viewing a particular story or the way a particular story is handled. So, given that, the question really is then, is it even possible for people, readers and listeners and viewers, to be aware that they're being manipulated by it. Because I'm thinking of, you had mentioned the internet age, and I believe that there has been this blurring of the lines between what is truly the press, as you would refer to them as professional journalists that have professional standards, and bloggers who are used for political purposes, religious purposes. And it does seem that there is a kind of blurring of the lines, because journalists are even using bloggers as sources, and bloggers are putting out stories as fodder for journalists. So, how can we maybe even blame people for being confused because they're being influenced by these stories? So is it possible to kind of sort all of that out for a lay person that's not a professional journalist to say, yeah, maybe I'm watching something that is terribly biased here?
Well, first of all, I would say that the confusion is real, and someone who is confused about this has an accurate view of the subject. If you're not confused, you're not paying attention. in the internet age, there are so many sources and so many brand names that we have accepted for decades are now behaving in ways that are tragic, in my opinion, as an old-fashioned, or just plain old, journalist. The other thing I would say is our people need to understand that in some publications, different parts of the paper may give you quality of coverage of certain types of subjects. For example, business news. Business news is probably one of the last bastions of very old school, objective, in terms of quality of standards, objective journalism. And that's in part because the readers of the business sections and of business publications, they aren't going to spend millions of dollars to get information from sources they know are telling them untruths. They just simply won't go for it. Too much is at stake. But then then you get to a publication like, and I hate to pick on one here, but I'm going to both praise it and criticize it. You get to a publication like the Washington Post, and you look at its coverage of, let's say, white evangelicals, just to pick everybody's whipping boy, right now in the American press. If you read the political section, if you read the work of most, not all, but most of their political reporters, you're going to get highly stereotypical and sometimes inaccurate coverage of the world of evangelicalism. They're going to, for example, say that the figure 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump means that all evangelicals just love Trump and he can do no wrong. When if you dig inside that and read excellent books like Tim Carney's book, Alienated America, you find out that in the primaries, in the Midwest in particular, the more devout evangelicals were, the less likely they were to vote for Donald Trump. Yet at the same time, there were pro-Trump evangelicals who helped get him rolling as a candidate in the primaries. He started building up those winner-take-all primary things, and eventually, to some people's joy and other people's horror, he became the nominee. So now all of a sudden, evangelicals found themselves with a choice between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Now, faced with that choice, many evangelicals bit their lower lips and voted for Trump. Others voted for third parties, and an unusually high percentage of evangelicals, this is a fact nobody points out very often, quite a few evangelicals didn't vote at all in 2016. One evangelical friend of mine said that he went into the polling place, voted for Trump, went back out into his pickup truck and threw up because he couldn't believe what he had just done. But at the same time, he couldn't believe that that was the choice he had to make, that those were what he thought were his only two options. Okay, now back to journalism. If you go to the religion reporters at the Washington Post, You may not agree with what they're doing or reporting 99.9% of the time, but you're going to find a completely different level of competency, accuracy, and quite frankly, you're going to read interesting material because they're going to show you the complexities that exist within different religious groups and within the debates there. At Get Religion, we are known from time to time to criticize professional religion reporters, and it's always kind of painful when we do that, because the other truth we know is that the few professional, trained, skilled religion writers we have in American media, they do such a better job than the reporters that don't get religion at all, or even worse, their religion is politics, and they force everything they see in religion through the lens of politics. And it just comes out warped and skewed and damaged.
So just one follow-up question, though, about your example of the Washington Post. Is the reason that they kind of lumped everybody together as evangelicals and said 81% of evangelicals voted for Trump, is that to make a political point? A kind of an undercurrent?
They needed to blame someone, I think. I mean, the press went into such shock, when it all turned out that they were wrong, and he got elected, and quite frankly, quite a few journalists to this day haven't accepted the fact that he was elected president of the United States.
Right.
I think there is reason to wonder whether Trump will handle defeat well, but we can tell you this, that a lot of journalists didn't handle defeat well 4 years ago. So
that's a good point.
You end up with our press being driven more into this advocacy media. Now let me share with you a very solid reason for that. We live in an age which, for technological reasons and financial reasons, being biased now makes economic sense. And the reason is that we've moved out of the age of broad-based advertising for Chevrolets and supermarkets and all these big, broad advertising groups that funded the traditional American model of the press. And your paper landed on your front door, and liberals and conservatives and everybody read the same paper or several of the papers, and they chose between them. And it was advertising driven. Well, the advertising dollars have now been hoovered up almost completely by YouTube, Facebook, Google, by the big tech four now control the digital advertising market, which is why all over America you have so many newspapers shrinking and declining and vanishing, which is tragic, by the way. I think we'll always have lots of journalism in places like New York and Washington, but state capitals and major cities in other parts of the country, we're literally, in a couple of years, especially with this current recession, we could be looking at major cities in America who no longer have a daily independent newspaper. And our system of government is not supposed to function like that. Without that, Thomas Jefferson said if he had to make a choice between, the government and the newspapers, he'd go with newspapers because at least you'd have discourse and you'd get a government again eventually. But the other reason it makes economic sense is if digital advertising doesn't work, and it really doesn't work in most newspapers. And if you doubt me about that, pick up your smartphone and look at it and call up a news site and tell me how much you enjoy dealing with the pop-up ads when you try to read anything on your smartphone.
Right.
I mean, you're not supposed to have advertised.
Yeah, now they're trying to stop you. There are pop-ups from the newspaper or whatever saying, "Hey, if you want to support our efforts, turn off your pop-up blockers." Yeah.
Or even more, what a radical idea, even try subscribing to the paper. But when you subscribe to the paper, this is where things get interesting. The New York Times right now is rolling in millions and millions of dollars worth of new digital subscribers all over the United States. Years ago, David Brooks had a great line that you could tell you were in liberal suburbs of cities because you could spot the blue New York Times delivery bags in the driveways using space satellites. They were that thick on the ground. Well, they're not getting their blue bags anymore. They're all digital, and they've got it on their smartphones and their iPads and their computers.
Right.
But the problem with having all of these subscribers is that at some point, if they are really pulling the reins, at some point you have to produce a product that a certain type of consumer wants. At which point now, you're no longer being funded primarily by advertising and other forms of, monetary sources. Now, the subscribers and to some degree Twitter, they are now your boss. We've seen several scandals at the New York Times, for example, and I mean scandals in the sense of battles within the newsroom, to where they would publish a headline that's perfectly accurate, but your typical, out there in internet land and Twitter, your typical progressive, liberal, frankly, quite secular New York Times reader gets furious and starts bombarding the paper, and eventually they rewrite the headline, or they rewrite the story, or it steers the coverage. Down in the South, we have a phrase for this, and that phrase is preaching to the choir.
Right.
At some point, these newsrooms are telling people what they want to hear and reaffirming their biases and their point of view. And going into the 2016 election, they weren't interested in the half of America that was quietly preparing to rebel and vote for Trump. So they were completely blindsided. The woman who was the reader's representative for the Times, a liberal writer there in New York named Liz Spayed, she wrote a series of brilliant columns in which she basically said the key issue right now is whether the New York Times actually wants to do accurate, informed coverage of half of America. Or are we only going to talk to our own readers and ignore the actual debates that are taking part in our country? And the Times' response was interesting. They fired her.
Wow.
And we've had another blow up in that war recently with the resignation of a left of center columnist named Barry Weiss, which we could talk about that in a second. But that to me is what the resignation of Barry Weiss was, a sign that we've moved into an entire new era of being able to say the media is liberal or not. Yes. And we'll come back to that in a while.
Yes. Yeah. I read about the Barry Weiss thing on your blog. And honestly, I never, you put that together so well, especially the idea that now it's no longer advertising driven, but it's subscriber driven, and the subscribers are going to call the shots. And if they don't read what they want to read in the way that they want to read it, they'll go somewhere else. They'll take their dollars away. Fascinating. Never heard it put that way.
And in effect, that's like the editorial shows every evening on Fox News that have to produce a certain point of view for the Fox viewer versus the MSNBC evening shows, which are all the whole network, that have to produce things that please those viewers. Sure. And the problem now is that's creeping out into the bloodstream of the entire media. So when you try to tell people, pastor, priest, father, what sources can we trust? You no longer can say, trust this publication.
Right.
Because part of it might be fine, part of it might be totally skewed. Some of the bylines might be excellent, and others might just be whacked out completely, especially if you care about the intersection of religion, morality, culture, and American public life.
All right, so let's get to that question. 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237. Terry, we have a caller, Brian from Cincinnati. Brian, you're on the air with Terry Mattingly. Welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And Terry, this is just so interesting. I could listen to this for 2 hours. To that question of where do we find a source? I'm sitting out here. I'm not a journalist. I didn't study this. I want to know what the truth is. And I found myself in the last 2 or 3 years, especially, hearing a president say everything is fake, and then a bunch of people believing it on both sides, I guess. And so I really want to know what's going on and who I can trust. And I find sites like Ad Fontes Media. Maybe you're familiar with that group. And they
Which
claim
one?
to show the Ad Fontes Media, to the source in Latin, Ad Fontes. And they have a great site. They claim they rate the bias. They show whether it's reliable or and do I trust even that? How does a normal person like me?
Right.
Because half the time I say to somebody, well, what you just posted on Facebook is absolutely fake because it says that in Snopes or this. Oh no, you can't trust anything. Well, how does anybody know how do I know what's true anymore?
Yeah.
What's the average person do?
A couple of years ago, about a year and a half ago now, I spoke at a national meeting of Missouri Synod Lutherans. And this was the exact question we ended up with. And I wished I could give them happy news, which is that I could point them to any one particular source. What I told them was how to engage in the battle of starting to figure this out on their own. And here's what I told them to do. First of all, are you on Twitter?
Yes.
Okay. Don't subscribe to a whole lot of things on Twitter. What I would suggest you do is find 10 to 20 individuals whose point of view intellectually, in some cases spiritually, you trust, and are people that you have found that their journalism consistently tends to tick off people on both the left and the right, which usually to me means they're doing something interesting. Let me give you some examples. One would be the well-known writer, an Orthodox writer by the name of Rod Dreher. Now, Rod is a moral and cultural conservative, but it's very difficult to pin a comfortable political label on Rod. Another would be Ross Douthat of the New York Times, who is a devout Catholic and brilliant, and the only morally conservative columnist at the New York Times. I would also suggest that you look up a man by the name of David French. And David French is an evangelical, a Harvard trained lawyer who's a specialist in religious liberty cases. And he's a very famous anti-Trump guy, but he's not pro-Democrat or pro-liberal. He's just convinced that Donald Trump never should have been president based on his moral quality, etc. But here's the key. David may make you mad at times, but he is a fierce defender of religious liberty and of basic First Amendment liberalism in terms of free speech, academic freedom, and a host of other things. My dear friend, even though I disagree with her on Trump, Molly Ziegler Hemingway. Molly Hemingway is worth following. I would pick a really, really good religion writer like Sarah Pulliam Bailey of the Washington Post. I would then also a news service, not a news service, a kind of an online newsletter that I find interesting is called Axios. No Orthodox connection to that, but they chose an interesting name, Axios. And once again, you won't agree with them all the time, but what they're going to give you is links to all kinds of sources of information, and they're going to pretty clearly identify the point of view. Now, the reason you want to collect this group of about 20 voices. There are some Catholic priests I follow. There are some Orthodox people I follow. There are some evangelicals I follow. Karen Swallow Prior, the evangelical and Southern Baptist writer, I follow closely. And what I'm looking for these people to help point me toward interesting news coverage. And one more name. Once again, you won't agree with her all the time, and that's a good thing. But Emma Green, the lead religion writer at The Atlantic, is doing extremely interesting work, especially on topics of religious liberty. And if you're paying attention to American life right now, the First Amendment is up for grabs. And the future of First Amendment liberalism is something that all people of good faith and all people of true tolerance have really got to be worried about right now. And I primarily follow people who help point me to interesting news about religion, public life, and the First Amendment. Now, I told you not to subscribe to too many people, because otherwise you can go into the tunnel of Twitter and never come out. Your goal is to keep that list of people you're following short, and you want to let Twitter save you time, not waste your time. And eventually, by trying to read what these people are reading and what they're talking about, you're going to start finding writers and sources that I think will point you toward interesting information. I'll name one more, and this is real provocative, or it will be to some of our listeners. I would suggest you follow Andrew Sullivan. Andrew Sullivan is one of the leading gay rights activists in the world and has been now for several decades. He is a kind of, how to describe him? He's an HIV positive, liberal, Catholic, libertarian conservative. How about that? But Andrew Sullivan is a fierce defender of religious liberty and the First Amendment. When Andrew Sullivan is booed at gay rights assemblies for defending the religious liberty rights of evangelicals, you know we live in an interesting age. So did that help? This is a battle plan that I think listeners should try on their own, because you're not going to get an easy answer. You want to find some people who are interesting, provocative, and trustworthy to help you wrestle with this.
It does help very much. Thank you. I've been following as you're talking, and I see that you're following these people, so I know I'm on the right one. So thank you.
Yeah, and by the way, follow me as well, I would hope.
I just did tonight.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Brian, thanks so much for calling in. Terry, I want to follow up on something that Brian had talked about, and it's this chart that I think is pretty famous now, adfontesmedia.com. So, the way that they do it is by political slant, right? It's either left or right, and then it's either reliable or unreliable. And it seems like the way that the truth is maybe somewhere in the middle there. I'm not really sure, but they seem to be saying, look at things like Bloomberg and NBC, and you had mentioned Axios and Politico and so forth. These are all kind of grouped in the middle. Is that a reliable way, or I should say, is that a helpful way to lay out all of the different news outlets and say, head for the middle?
Well, first of all, on moral and cultural and social issues, would you consider the New York Times to be in the middle?
No.
Yeah, me either. Although, like I said, they do great international coverage, and frankly, they frequently do great international coverage of religion. But the minute you get closer to moral and social and political issues in the United States, all hell breaks loose. So I think that upper box in that famous chart, the blue box of the people you're basically supposed to trust, I would stress that all of those publications are doing work that's worth reading on some subjects.
Right.
But to say that you can trust that brand the way you used to think you could, that simply doesn't work in the economic and technological and political age in which we live. Things were pretty bad even before Trump. I mean, Mitt Romney was a fascist. Do you remember that? George W. Bush was a fascist. Mitt Romney hated women, and was a misogynist.
Right.
I mean,
right.
That wasn't that long ago.
Yep.
But Trump completely pushed this situation over the edge for many people on both the right and the left. And it's like what some people have called Trump derangement syndrome. I think that's a real condition, but I think there are some people on the right who are deranged by Trump almost as well as there are people on the left who are deranged by Trump. I am much more interested and I'm much more concerned about the fears and the hopes and the problems of people who felt they had no choice to vote for Trump than I am, frankly, what's going on between the ears of Donald Trump himself. I'm very clearly on my websites identified as a never Trumper, and I was a never Hillary person as well. I'm going to be voting third party again in this election. This is a not an easy age for people like Orthodox Christians whose views of the world don't fit neatly inside the political boxes established by the two major parties.
Indeed. 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. If you have any questions regarding media bias, your favorite news outlet, whatever it is, give Terry a call here. We'd love to hear from you. Terry, there are also some comments in the chat room, some questions here that I'd like to bring up to you and get your reaction to. One is from Dave. He says, do many journalists, when writing about religion, assume that religion is the cause of all the bad things in the world?
No, I don't think that's true at all. I think that's simplistic. I think they assume that there's good religion and there's bad religion. And that the bad religion tends to be a lot of ancient stuff that believes it knows what is right and what is wrong. And then there's good religion that's kind of evolving and changing and helping everybody love each other the way they should. The book that has influenced me more than any other in the last, it's coming up on 3 decades now, is a book called Culture Wars by a sociologist named James Davison Hunter. And when he uses the term culture wars, he's not just saying about arguments about abortion or moral and social issues, the way that term is usually defined in the press. He has a very interesting point of view. After years of studying this as a sociologist of religion, he has decided that America is no longer divided between Catholics and Protestants and Jews and mainline Protestants and evangelicals and whatever. He said America is now divided by a vertical slash, not those horizontal denominational slashes. And the vertical slash is on one side are the people that he calls the camp of the progressives. And the progressives believe that all truth is experiential and evolving. And on the other side of the slash is the group he calls the camp of the Orthodox, with a small o. And the camp of the Orthodox believes that transcendent, eternal truth is possible. Now, an Orthodox with a large O Jew may not believe the same things as a traditional Catholic or a conservative Southern Baptist or an Eastern Orthodox Christian. But the fact that they believe there is eternal truth and that they believe that transcendent standards are possible means that Orthodox Jew may in some ways be closer to the evangelical or the conservative Catholic or the Missouri Synod Lutheran than they would be to a Reformed Jew or a cultural secular Jew. And a liberal Catholic might be have more in common with an American Baptist or a PCUSA Presbyterian or a Reformed Jew than they do with a conservative Catholic. And the dividing line for most of us I would say bluntly, post Roe v. Wade, the dividing line has ended up being the sexual revolution, the definition of gender and family, and all of that turns into the battle to control the Supreme Court.
Right.
The only thing in America that seems to have the power to force people to do anything and settle all our disputes. So Hunter's book is must reading, but this division between transcendent truth and evolving truth, I think, is at the heart of it. So the press isn't anti-religion. The press is disturbed and angry and afraid of what it would call bad religion. And bad religion, for many journalists, is any religion that clashes with the editorial page of the New York Times.
Oh, boy. Oh, my.
And the New York Times then serves as kind of a college of cardinals for the media that feed half of America.
That is scary. Here's another question for you, Terry. This is from Steve. He says, Marshall McLuhan said that the medium is the message.
Yeah.
Does that mean that the structure of the technology delivering the news determines the content of the news that is delivered?
Okay, what's the name here? I got to know if this is one of my former students who's goading me.
Steve K. He just said Steve K.
Okay. I did my second master's degree at the University of Illinois. And the phrase there that was used all the time was technology shapes content. Well, this is exactly what we were talking about earlier with the restructuring of the media by the subscriber biases versus the advertising biases. And what I would say with that is that the internet does one thing better than anything else. Digital technology and the internet divides us into tiny, narrow niches and subgroups. It's what that technology does the best. And the hot term right now is silos. All over America, even in something like QAnon. QAnon is a I would argue, rumor-based conspiracy theory silo. But to the people who live inside that silo, their news information and sources, it doesn't matter if they're QAnon in Florida or Maine, San Diego or Alaska, they're reading the same stuff. And the same thing is true with Rush Limbaugh listeners. And the same thing is true with New York Times editorial page readers. And a lot of the Jacobin, the influential Jacobin newsletter and news source. The people are living inside their own narrow sources of news. And at some point, they can't even debate people with other points of view because they have no idea what those people think or believe.
Right.
And meanwhile, we live in a culture that is desperately in need of honest, accurate debate and maybe even some compromises in an attempt to save a tolerant, united culture, if that's possible. At some point, we may have to at least be able to compromise enough to agree on what we're going to disagree about. That's where a voice like Andrew Sullivan is so crucial. And others. We need to find the people on the left and the right who are both committed to the free speech and religious liberty and freedom of people with whom they disagree. And that used to be what our media was good at, was saying, here's what one group of people say, accurately reported with on-the-record sources, and here's what the other side says. Now read these two and try to figure this out for yourself.
Right.
That was that old American model of the press. And frankly,
won't tell you what to think. Right.
Yeah, the listener is saying the truth. The technology, in large part, has taken that away from us, because the last thing the internet does is produce consensus.
Yeah, I mean, when you have a place like Twitter where you can just throw out jabs at, 140 characters or less, and of course you have the president, doing that at all hours of the night, and then people jumping on him, and when he got sick saying, I hope you die. I think the idea of intelligent conversation and discourse has kind of gone out the window, and that becomes the new model for people to interact. Terry, here's another question for you. It says, what is your view and best guess on the future of the push to designate social media platforms like Facebook as publishers instead of platforms?
Well, first of all, they are capitalistic commercial enterprises, which means that as much as it may drive us nuts, it's not a violation of the First Amendment when Facebook decides to, shut up the Babylon Bee or some other conservative sources. Mm-hmm. People who have commercial enterprises can do things like that. It's a violation of the First Amendment when the government does it. But see, the problem we have right now is, at this point, you would have to say that the voices of big tech, like Google and Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, you'd have to say at this point that they're no longer functioning as individual platforms that just exist and you can pay attention to them or not. They're now functioning more like public utilities of information in which you can't run for president if you were blocked from Facebook. You can't a religious organization can't make a case for its beliefs if it's declared a hate group by Apple, YouTube, etc. These people have the power that these companies wield make the robber barons and the railroad barons of the 19th century look like Boy Scouts. When you consider their power in the nature of our public square at this point in time. So that's a great question. I do not have an answer, but I know it's tremendously important. And it also, of course, doesn't help that conservatives with money have basically been anti-journalism for decades, and religious schools have basically been anti-journalism for decades. So the conservative side of American life is doing nothing to raise up quality voices to compete with any of these utilities. Can I make one other point before we need to go?
Oh, please.
At the end of this thing?
Yeah, I have one more question from a listener, but go ahead, sure.
No, you hit me with that, and then I'll make one statement to wrap up.
Okay. Amelia, sorry, I just went off that screen. Amelia said that she just purchased a book called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. She said it's quite a tome. Do you recommend it if you're knowledgeable of it?
I'm not familiar with that book. I'm probably reading a lot more shallower material than that right now. Although, I've got David French's new book on whether America is going to have a civil war. I have that queued up, and I've just started Rod Dreher's new book, the sequel to his Benedict option book, and it's called Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents. I'm reading a whole lot of stuff right now related to the First Amendment, politics, and religion. So I'm just going to have to pass on that one because I can't evaluate a book that I don't know anything about.
Absolutely. Thank you. And just for our listeners' sake, that is by Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T.
Oh, I know that last name, H-A-I-G-H-T?
H-A-I-D-T. H-A-I-D-T.
Oh, then that's a different author.
Haidt.
Okay, I'm sorry.
The Righteous Mind. It looks like a #1 bestseller, at least on Amazon. Okay, this was the quickest hour, I think, in the history of this show. And please tell us your final thoughts here, Terry. Everybody was hanging on your every word. It was just really fascinating. Tremendous insights.
Well, that would be a first, and it never happened to me in the classroom. So, okay, let's put it this way. I think one of the things that readers need to be concerned about, and this takes us back to James Davison Hunter and to David French and others. What we're watching right now, this old American model of the press was linked to what most people would call modernity and to the old liberalism. And the old liberalism was what some people called an orthodoxy of no orthodoxies. Our press was supposed to be skeptical. It was supposed to treat everybody the same. And that used to infuriate a lot of religious believers. But it was kind of like that court system you and I started out talking about. It wasn't what you wanted, but you knew how it worked. And you knew you could trust some of the information or a lot of the information that came out of it. I think right now that old liberalism, that orthodoxy of no orthodoxies, is now dying in our newsrooms, and a new orthodoxy is emerging. And this is where, like I said a while ago, there's good religion and bad religion. Look at it this way. There's good religion and there's bad religion, and the New York Times gets to tell you which is which. Yeah. And not only that, the New York Times gets to tell you which of those two religious perspectives deserves protection by the Supreme Court.
Incredible.
Now, this would be an openly advocacy-based journalism. The good guys would have on white hats, the bad guys would have on black hats, or in some cases red hats if they're Roman Catholic cardinals. But the problem is what happened to the debate that used to be at the heart of our media, to where you got to hear both sides. And here's an important point I'll end with. One of those old standards was that we wanted to try to treat people on both sides of these debates with respect. We were supposed to care whether the coverage was affecting and changing people's lives, and we wanted to try to be fair, balanced, and to treat people in the debates with respect. I don't think many of us right now feel that that's what we're sensing when we turn on the talk shows in the evening or hear people interpreting what happened during presidential debates or on election nights, or in what most concerns me, we don't hear respect for the people on both sides of issues about the family, gender, marriage, education, science, and a lot of other topics. And at this point, I believe, not all of it, but some pieces of our media establishment are actually hurting public discourse in America more than they're enabling it.
Terry, thank you so much for your insight, for your wisdom, for all of your observations. So very, very helpful. We want to encourage everybody to read more of Terry's works at tmatt.net, tmatt.net. Also, you can go to getreligion.org and see the good work that he edits there. Terry Mattingly, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Glad to be here. Hope to talk again.
All right. Very, very good. Thank you also to John and Trudy for engineering the program tonight, for everybody in the chat room, for those listening, for Brian for calling in, and for everybody who will listen by podcast. Here are some final thoughts. It's easy for us to get caught up in the things of this world. The 24-hour news cycle and the always-on social media influence can cause us to not only get caught up in these mundane matters, but be influenced in a way which may not be a cause for the truth. But here's what the scriptures say. Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And Philippians 4:8, finally, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there is any virtue, and if there is anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. And that's our show for tonight. Remember to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/ancientfaithtoday. Share out our program after that's posted. Give us your feedback and contact us with any ideas or topics that you might want to hear about. Join us next Tuesday evening as we discuss the issue of adoption with two Orthodox Christian moms who have two very different experiences on the next edition of Ancient Faith Today. Good night, everybody.